and socialization of the governance arrangement, that is behavioral practices. And my point of emphasis is that this discussion is framed within testing, some of these realities, so that one needs to move away from being reactive to a proactive response against the challenges that confront us. So the BRICS and the global architecture voices are aimed at advocating for a more just and equitable, inclusive international system. And I think we all agree that we are looking for inclusive solutions as a collective, to have a cogent response in addressing the issues that confront us. Now, if you look at the comparative analysis, I think the voice that is highly pronounced, especially here in South Africa, we are very passionate in resolving the issues of corruption. And the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, together with the President Jinping in China, their robust commitment in fighting corruption is very pronounced. But the question is, why do we still have issues of ethical challenges that confront us in the society? So my point of emphasis is even on this slide when we have Transparency International, that we know that do a barometer checks every year about the levels of corruption, and some of these countries which are in red, they are known to be highly corrupt, and those which are in yellow, they are very clean. But as we know that there's no country that is free of corruption. But I think what we also need in the BRICS community is to come with similar barometer, within the BRICS community that talk to what we are doing, so that we can assess ourselves properly and fit into this Transparency International. Otherwise, as we know, these ratings, as we talk about the corruption indexes, they give you a kind of a sense of the challenges that we have. But when you look at the corruption index from 2015 to 2017 of the Transparency International, it puts Nordic countries as the most countries which are less corrupt. But and when you look in the BRICS community, South Africa, China, India, Russia, and Brazil, they put them in the red, mostly on the middle there, between 40, 49. We're wrestling with ethical challenges. But I think what we need to underscore here is that we need to come with an instrument that is within the BRICS community to reflect these issues so that they can be validated. And this slide is just giving you a sense of an architecture that I'm trying to engage with, drawing it from the OECD framework about the governance architecture, the legal instruments, the watchdog or the institutional mechanisms, and the civil society. So you can realize that in Brazil, we have the legal instruments that deals with these issues of corruption, and institutional mechanisms that you can able to see in Brazil. They are there, prosecutorial institutions, as well as the civil society, which has coalition of NGOs which are reactive to this. Same with Russia, as you can see down. So it's just bringing a kind of a test in each layer of governance, the legal framework, the institutional mechanisms, as well as the civil society. So up to South Africa. So I think all the BRICS community have the institutional, legal, and civil society mechanisms to grapple with these issues of corruption. And I think in terms of the barometer check, I think there need to be a kind of an improvement in whatever we do. against these ethical challenges. But the question is why having all these, infrastructure or architecture, why are we still having challenged by the scourge of corruption? As I draw towards the end, I think, to me, you can have the legal, you can pass a number of laws, especially here in South Africa, we've passed a lot of them. All of these have these mechanisms as a way of grappling with this, but are we not missing the point? Are we shooting in the dark? And that's the question that I'm bringing. If you look at the global governance architecture, is informed or is embedded by the values of accountability, impartiality, integrity, and responsiveness, and all that we have embedded them in the legislations. But the question is, we need to begin to implement this type of legislation. We need to engage the civil society, the business, as well as the government to have an integrated mechanisms. And we need to lift this even beyond our country, but at the BRICS level, where we need to start developing a multi-pronged combating response mechanism that can able to deal with that. So as we develop the banks and so on, but I think we also need to concurrently bring these matters of ethics to fore. What this slide is telling you is that besides the legal system that we have, the process and all of this, I think the main problem here is the human factor, the human behavior, the conduct, which I think we need to bring into a resolve. And how do you do this? There's a need to have behavioral changes. So this is the architecture that I'm exploring. I have 5 years in working on this, taking that legal remedy, institutional remedy. But if you look at my extreme right, that's where I am saying that the problem lies with a human being. So you need to provide the behavioral mechanisms to be able to resolve the issue of corruption. That's why I'm talking about socialization, ethical consciousness, moral high grounds, character building, moral uprightness. These are the things so that will help us to be proactive, because the legal mechanisms are reactive instruments, which at the end of the day, they have not been proved to be successful. So instead of coming with a barking dog, that shakes the status quo, my point is that we need to come with a proactive and not reactive mechanism, and embedding values in the society. It will take long, but at the end of the day, it will bear fruits. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Barbara. As usual, you kept the time and you gave a very clear and insightful presentation about the ethics and working with governance, architecture in BRICS countries. We are all aware that even in BRICS countries, corruption, governance issues play a predominant role in financing. We know about the capital flight issues. Much research has been done in Africa, but in countries like China also, capital flight and the way money leaves the country illegally is a lot to do with the way in which finance that can be used to develop BRICS, to provide development, to focus on unemployment, inequality, and poverty, is leaving the country instead of being reinvested, and finds its way into developed countries which actually don't need the finance. So the issues that you raised, Barbara, bring to the fore the kind of things that we need to address in BRICS. Besides the summit decisions and all that, we need to focus on how we can keep the finances and maintain the governance issues so that service delivery can be a key area in meeting the demands of the people. So we thank you very much for that. I think we won't spend too much time now. We'll have time later on for discussion because we don't have one more speaker yet. But we'll now have Dr. Buntu Siwisa, who will talk about the nexus between funding, peace, security, and development in Africa. This issue of peace and security in Africa was one of the key areas that the BRICS summit highlighted. But we want to link this to the financing. How can financing for development mitigate some of the causes that force people into conflict and force people to leave the continent in search of a better life elsewhere? So I'd like to call on Dr. Buntu Siwisa, who's an independent consultant and worked with the Department of Industry, Trade and Industry, and worked also within the Tower University Accord program. Buntu?
Good afternoon, Minister. Afternoon, delegates from other BRICS countries, and afternoon, colleagues. It's always a pleasure to present and to contribute to BRICS development debates, because I've been privy to observations of how BRICS has matured institutionally. So it's always been a pleasure to contribute to these development debates. My presentation and my aim of my presentation this afternoon is not to force us into concrete or cemented ways of thinking about funding of peace and security challenges, but rather to get our to marshal our thinking together on how we should find normatively and practically together ways of thinking on funding peace and security challenges, particularly peace and security challenges in pursuit of sustainable development. And this is also not an assumption that BRICS as a collective has not made any progress in funding peace and security challenges in pursuit of sustainable development. But the point of all this is to try and find together, or try and move towards a more collective, coherent, and systematic method of approach in finding peace and security development challenges. And so that's basically an outline of my presentation. And as I've pointed out, at the core of my presentation, or at the core of the goal, is the realization of that there's an intrinsic link between peace, security, and development. Or in another way, that the achievement of peace and security should lead towards sustainable development. And so that is that goal, and that is at the heart of that. And so when we want to achieve that, I think it's quite important that we should define what we mean by funding and define what we should mean by funding in a more specific way that is context driven in this way, in this manner. And that funding in this should mean the provision of finance to facilitate the transfer, movement, monitoring and evaluation of the performance of resources, skills, knowledge and expertise to conflict and conflict areas in pursuit of holistic development. Now, the most important aspects to take out from that definition is that we should move away from the traditional perspective of funding, that funding on peace and security tends to come in at the tail end of conflict, or tends to come in when the dust has settled down in conflict or in post-conflict areas. And then, or when development needs at the end of conflict come in. And so there's the traditional way of of funding peace and security challenges, that finance is dropped either at the end or at the beginning of a conflict, and so that rather the financing should be embedded within the entire process of peace and security, of addressing peace and security challenges. And so one of the other things that I point out, which is quite important and that we should challenge, is that much of multilateral development investment tends to focus on infrastructure development. And indeed, there is, as I've pointed out in the slide, there is a need for infrastructure development gap, as the new development bank, Zakela Maesa, also pointed out. But we should also introduce development debates within the infrastructure investment, so that we can then be able to dissect and come out with any conflict and peace security needs within the infrastructure development debate. Because what tends to happen is that there is at times a relapse to conflict or a relapse to tension despite the embeddedness of infrastructure investment. So, so what I've come out with is that financing should adopt a systematic form and a comprehensive form of funding, following, I think it's better illustrated in this diagram, and that it follows a flow, that it first should focus on funding political processes, and not just identifying peacemaking processes and dialogues, but funding them and being part of them. Like, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa generally now, areas that are challenged by peacemaking issues. For instance, Lesotho, how do we look at civilian-military relations in Lesotho, for instance, that we can foresee will affect overall economic and socio-economic challenges? And so therefore, when we fund, we do not fund development needs that will come out of peace and security challenges, but from the beginning of peace initiatives. And then that this usually flows on to funding political inclusivity. That once we have invested such forms of financing in these types of situations, how do we ensure that relationships between people who are affected by the conflict and institutions and processes, how do we ensure that confidence has been rebuilt between the two, so that conflicts are not, there's no relapse to conflict, and capacity buildings as well. And then this process does not necessarily have to flow. It depends on context to context. And so then the model that I suggest loosely that we should follow, which should fit into the previous broader framework, is that the BRICS should focus on three priority programs. Three priority programs which I think should also, which will fit in broadly to that flow chart that I showed, is that it's on security, justice, and human rights, and that this needs to be linked with the measurement mechanisms of Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace and security, and core government functionality. And this particularly works on South-South or South-South-North cooperation models with countries that have either just undergone conflict or are in post-conflict situations. For instance, twinning between countries where skills, knowledge, and expertise are imparted by one country to another. And so the funding then should be part of this, because it should also ensure monitoring and evaluation, and then socio-economic revitalization. This is also quite important because a lot of conflicts tend to emerge not from macro political situations, but they tend to emerge from day-to-day socio-economic conflicts, and then tend to widen. For instance, in the Eastern DRC, some of the conflicts, they tend to emerge either from land tenure security, which is linked to youth employment, and then this then affects the radicalization of the youth by terrorist organization. And even in Eastern Africa, the term Al-Shabaab, it basically comes from youth in Arabic, which comes from how youth in that particular area were neglected, and then this gathered momentum to the point that it became a political concern and a source of conflict. So this area of socio-economic revitalization is quite important as well, that it is embedded in long-term and systematic forms of funding. And so what we have neglected within BRICS is how we should ensure complementarities and synergies between BRICS development agencies, because BRICS development agencies have been working in silos. They've been working, I would say, effectively, but working in silos, and also they've not really been exposed in their work. And as the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Professor Mutwa, pointed out at the beginning of this session this morning, she said that we should let us liberate our agency for change. And I would rather say than let us liberate our agencies for change. And so I think BRICS should actively develop synergies between the BRICS development agencies, because although the other presentation by Komyakov pointed out that there are fewer research partnerships, but there have been sizable research development outcomes that have come up from these partnerships that we could exploit on peace and security outcomes from the studies that BRICS countries have made, and then we could utilize the competencies of the BRICS development agencies. I've listed them out there. And so, and then the next slide goes on our imprint, BRICS different countries' imprint on peacekeeping and peace building. Laid them out over there, that they're basically sizable, but at the same time, the criticism that I have is that there is no sense of coherence, and there is no sense of looking for inbred peace building challenges and mechanisms together in a coherent and systematic way. And we move on to South-South and South-South-North, or triangular cooperation methods that I think we should pursue as BRICS countries. And in conclusion, 4 points that BRICS countries have to make a concerted effort of using their development agencies to conceive, design, develop, and analyze various mechanisms of funding. That basically we have what we have, but there is no sense of seriously thinking of how to cohere in our thinking. And that the starting point should be harvesting from the various research projects on peace and security that have already been undertaken by various BRICS research groups. And that the NDB and the other multilateral development banks and institutes should play a central role and integral role in the conceptualization, design, analysis, monitoring, and evaluation of these projects. And that lastly, that the development bank should work with the BRICS development agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ubuntu. It was, as usual, an excellent rendition of the combination of factors that can make peace and security a reality in Africa. Because if you can't ensure the well-being of people, then the outcome most likely will be conflict and migration and the exodus that we are seeing. So I remember in 2017, we had a meeting of the G20 in Berlin, and forced migration was one of the key issues. And one of the reasons for forced migration was because of the poverty, inequality, unemployment, underdevelopment in Africa. And that also, one of the big factors was the lack of governance and ethics in the way in which governments run the countries. So I thank you for bringing forward the notion that with development finance, we can actually mitigate some of the factors that encourage conflict in Africa. So with that, I would like to now, we're supposed to have here the credit rating challenges for partnerships and BRICS ones, Tumi Dlamini, but unfortunately she could not make it and we couldn't get a substitute in time. So, but we can later on chat about that. I'm sure Professor Ben Chenglin can talk about the credit rating, role of credit rating agencies, and how perhaps we can create one within BRICS, because currently there are 3 credit rating agencies that dominate the world: Standard & Poor, Fitch, and what's the other one, Ben? Moody's. And we know that Standard & Poor was implicated in the financial crisis in the 2008, 2009, because they are basically working in the interest of the clients, which are the banks. So how can BRICS create a credit agency that can give the balance of forces away from the Western credit rating agencies? That was Eddie Modoko's topic, but unfortunately he's not here to present it. But I know they decided to consider a credit rating agency at BRICS at the summit, at the last summit. So I think there's going to be a commission set up to discuss that issue. So perhaps when we come to the end of our presentations, then we can probably have a short discussion around that, so we don't lose the initiative around that. But now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Ronnie Nkwadi. Professor Nkwadi, myself, and colleagues from Russia, China, from Renmin University, and Brazil. We published a book last year on using currencies, our own currencies, on transactions amongst BRICS rather than using the dollar. And we tried to think about what ways in which we can mitigate the crisis of foreign currency reserves that countries need. And the book was widely published within BRICS, and Professor Nkwadi now will talk about South Africa's role and how we can use foreign currency, our own currencies for transactions within BRICS. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see many of you here this afternoon. I'm here to talk about the wider use of national currencies in international settlements for BRICS. The international monetary system's dependence on the US Federal Reserve monetary policy has always been a concern for the emerging and developing countries. Developing countries and emerging economies are very wary of the negative spillover effects of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, because the US places national economic interest above the interests of the other countries. After the Asian crisis in 1997, the emerging economies raised the issue of extending the use of national currencies to cover a wide spectrum of international settlements. The global financial crisis also confirms their concerns about the risk which emanates from the US dollar dominant role in the global economy. And the financial markets, their reaction towards the US economy proves and shows that it's an opportune time for the emerging and developing countries to start integrating their finances. The rise of Donald Trump and the call for protectionism and raising the tariffs and his philosophy on America for Americans first, again proves the fact that it's about time that the BRICS economies start around to see how they can start making use of their own currencies. With the BRICS currencies significantly increasing their share of the global GDP and national trade during the 2000s, international financial markets began to take a greater interest in their national currencies. Most of the BRICS countries have recently fully or partially lifted the restrictions on foreign exchange rates. Moreover, the dynamic economic growth allows the group member countries to enhance macroeconomic stability and further develop their financial markets in the emerging economies. So there's a need, therefore, and a concern to stabilize the international financial system following the global financial crisis, which was underscored at the second BRIC Heads of State Summit, which was held in Brazil 2010, where the leaders of the group declared a greater need for more stable, predictable, and diversified international monetary systems, and showed their readiness to study the possibilities of international settlement using their local currencies. The 2010 declaration was given a greater agency in the BRICS Russia Summit Declaration in 2015, in which leaders of the group acknowledged and supported initial expert findings that the potential for expanding the use of such settlement in BRICS national currencies was indeed a matter of importance for promoting further economic and financial cooperation among BRICS economies, which will then help these countries to mitigate the instability that arises as a result of the US dominance in the markets. The modern international monetary system based on the US dollar is being criticized for its shortcomings. The US Federal Reserve's monetary policy runs counter to the emerging market and developing economies' monetary policy objectives, which are aimed at controlling exchange rates, lowering inflation and interest rates, and stimulating economic growth and employment. Financial systems in emerging economies frequently suffer the spillover effects of the US monetary policy that provokes capital outflows and inflows. So research in this area resulted in a well-founded academic opinion pointing that the risk of sudden US liquidity drop may be smoothed by wider use of national currencies in international settlements. So the use of national currencies in international settlements presumes a long and complicated transition towards internationalization amongst the BRICS economies. This means a step-by-step promotion of national currency, one as a unit of account, as a medium of exchange, and a store of value at international level. A national currency becomes a unit of account when a foreign contract's price is invoiced in such a currency. It serves as a medium of exchange when final settlements are made, and as a store of value when non-residents purchase assets denominated in this currency. So the rationale that we can give regarding the wider use of national currencies, it is well understood and established in the literature that multilateralism can ensure better utilization of global resources and mutually beneficial investment towards full employment than bilateralism or regional blocs. International investment and interconnectedness economies avoid political disputes that are typical in the formation of regional blocs. If you can cooperate under the conditions where there are no problems with balancing imports and exports, and domestic expenditure combined with foreign finance long-term loans, is sufficient for investment to secure full employment. In addition to international investment, as international investment in an interconnected economy, it will ensure that economic prosperity for trading partners spill over through mutual expansion of exports amongst the BRICS economies. However, unless there is a mutually agreed framework over the control of international financial instruments, multilateral trade relations will be in the interest of the prevailing global hegemonic economic power and will shape the way trade, rivalry, and trade relations are conducted. Currently, trade relations and trade rivalries among emerging and developing economies are dominated and determined by the dollar, the euro, and the pound sterling and the yen. The announcement by the IMF in October 2016 that the renminbi is now part of the IMF basket of reserve currencies offers both China and its big partners an effective financial instrument for international investment and trade relationships, and this news is welcomed both ends. This is not without risks anyway, but how do you mitigate these risks? Internationalization of currency offers some benefits to the issuing country and also poses certain risks. As early as 1960, Triffin proves that inflation risks are fostering while a national currency's share in international settlement is growing, thus jeopardizing its exchange rate for stability and credibility among the global markets. So what do we need to see? An issuing country should achieve a significant share in the global economy and international trade within its region, at least. Secondly, there should be macroeconomic stability that should be ensured amongst the BRICS economies, thus presuming predictability of the monetary policy, consistently low level of inflation, and a mild rate exchange fluctuations. A country should have a well-developed and liquid financial market, providing a wide range of foreign exchange and stock market instruments. And lastly, a foreign exchange regulation should also be investor-friendly and not restrictive to international settlement in national currency. So, what is the state of internationalization currently? As I've mentioned earlier on, that the renminbi share is being recognized as a reserve currency. It also has got a bigger share in the markets than other BRICS currencies in foreign trade turnover. It amounts to approximately 22% of Chinese foreign trade volume. The Russian ruble follows closely behind 20%. so that the two currencies are well ahead of the currencies of India, Brazil, and South Africa. So in China, for example, following the nationalization of renminbi, China is experienced a currency depreciation and faced a conflict between capital account opening and domestic financial stability because of the capital outflow, forcing the country's policymakers to make appropriate adjustment to capital account convertibility and also the internationalization of that currency. Russia opted for removing nearly all restrictions on the ruble transaction with non-residents, both current and capital account by now. However, such measures have not yet proven beneficial for widening its usage at the national level. Russian experience has shown the limits and constraints of partial internationalization, which exacerbate underdevelopment. So Russian experience also demonstrates the risk of internationalization for macroeconomic stability caused by increasing vulnerability and exposure to external shocks. So such coordination becomes vitally important to coordinate the currencies of the various countries amongst BRICS economies. Close refer to India's experience, India's monetary authorities within the current macroeconomic framework focus on facilitating access to the foreign exchange market for non-residents and on developing the offshore bonds market denominated in Indian rupees. Their intention is to lower the foreign exchange requirements for servicing foreign debt and to promote development of hedging markets. Thereby, the preconditions for gradual expansion of the usage of Indian rupee in international settlement are being created in the long term. In the case of Brazil, Brazil presents an interesting example in this respect of internationalization of its currency. In 2009, the country was among the initiators and participants of the pioneering regional payment system. They created a system for settlement of using their local currencies in that region. However, it is constrained by remaining foreign exchange restrictions and incomplete convertibility of the Brazilian real and Argentina peso. Despite the small share of payments made under the system in relation to the total volume of bilateral trade, both countries keep being committed to using the system of local currency use. In South Africa, South Africa's experiences clearly showed that even a relatively developed financial market, the financial assets to GDP ratio of the country exceeds the corresponding variables in all other BRICS countries and are tantamount to advanced economy levels. It does not completely safeguard from the problems inherent for a resource-based economy. Therefore, further diversification of the national economy is needed to ensure macroeconomic stability and enhance national currencies use in international settlements. So it is important, therefore, to ensure that the currencies in the BRICS economies are coordinated such that we are able to use these currencies widely amongst the BRICS bloc, as this will help to solve the problems of exchange rate that are pegged to dollar. And also these countries will be able to smooth the trade relations amongst themselves, which will at the end of the day boost the economy and build BRICS economy, the international finances of the BRICS economies. So BRICS countries experience shows that a balanced development of all necessary and sufficient preconditions have to be in place for a national currency internationalization to establish a solid base for its considerable share in international settlement. So this calls for some tests to be done to test as to whether or not the BRICS countries are ready for internationalizing their currencies and moving towards a common currency goal. We had to test to see whether the shocks within the BRICS countries are correlated. Was it very correlated that could mean a bit of a problem? But if they are correlated, then we can talk about an area where common currency can be tested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kwadi. I think that was very insightful. And I think at some point last year we were thinking of using this to launch the book that Professor Ben and his team produced on the internationalization of the renminbi. But unfortunately, we couldn't have this conference last year, so we had it this year. And this particular project we worked on with Babalwa, she's not here at the moment, one of our researchers, and Professor Kwadi, to develop this issue and this book. But if you go online to the BRICS Research Center website, you will find a copy of the book. It was published in Russia, and you'll be able to look at the experiences of all the BRICS countries in trying to consider the using local national currencies for transactions. Now, this particular presentation is not the presentation that was going to be done by Mr. Kamlesh and Pillay, but it's from the project that we worked on jointly, and it was for the South African BRICS think tank pre-academic forum on 3rd of May. So I'll present some of the areas of financing clean technologies in BRICS, but just give you a basic issue. One of the team members from China, Ms. Chao Chen, who is working from Fudan University with us on this project, and we're still going to work together to look at, because the issue here that I raised at the Paris meeting before the COP21 meeting in 2015, there was a discussion in Paris around this. And one of the big problems is that countries like China, India, and South Africa are great users of coal in production of electricity and energy. South Africa produces 4% of the carbon emissions from the use of coal in Africa. China produces about 30% in Asia, and India uses about 60% of its electricity generated from coal and produces huge amounts of carbon emissions in that country. The problem, however, that we are faced with is how do we stop using coal? Because coal is one of the cheapest resources in these countries. And despite the abundance of solar and wind and hydroelectric power in Africa, coal is still considered to be the cheapest source for using and producing energy. So how do we move away from that? Because we are faced with another dilemma. The use of coal creates jobs in the country, not just in South Africa, in China and other countries. Zhejiang province, where she comes from, is one of the largest coal producers. And China is trying to downscale the use of coal. And that's threatening many jobs in that province as well. So these countries are faced with this massive dilemma. So in China, they've introduced a program to try and say, can we develop technologies that can make the use of coal cleaner? That means, can we use sequestrate the carbon emissions and use it for other purposes, and a whole range of other issues. That's a debate that's still going to happen. But I'm going to go through some of the background of the history of electricity in South Africa. We know that during the apartheid era, there were sanctions and isolation, and there was self-reliance on domestic resources, mainly coal. Today, 90% of generation in South Africa is from coal. Perhaps it's going to get lower. Then in the mid-2000s, the drivers for electricity policy were electricity diversification and security, climate change commitments, industrialization and job creation, and constrained fiscal space. We are still facing with the problems of government and ESCOM today, because again, it's what Professor Bravo was talking about, the issue of governance and ethics, especially with state-owned enterprise. I'm sure China faced this at some point, India is facing it currently, and in Brazil, the whole electricity energy crisis to a fall of a government there. So the big issue now is we are moving towards renewable energy, and there's a great focus in South Africa on coal. We've heard earlier that South Africa is now developing much of its investment into the renewable energy sector. So South Africa's refit program, renewable energy feed-in tariffs, is taking off, and we have an integrated resource plan moving from 2010 to 2030. So the future needs tries to achieve a balance between affordable price for electricity to support a global competitive economy and create local jobs. In 2009, we started this refit program to encourage private sector investments in renewable electricity generation. But there was a problem with competitive bidding, and the program was abandoned in 2011. So the idea here is, what are the advantages for this new program that has come into the force, which is called Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. And today there is still a debate as to how the bidding process on this takes place. But the advantages are that you have competitive bidding, you use economic development criteria, the private sector submits regeneration projects, and ESCOM signs power purchasing agreements with winning bidders, and the Department of Energy offers guarantees to the bidders. That was the idea in 2011. But the program did not take off as effectively because of the discussions and developments. By 2015, we had more than 6,300 megawatts of renewable electricity produced. There were 110,000 jobs that were created, and 75% of those will remain after the construction. 200 million rand worth of investment was put into the sector. The program, local value chain development, was a major success around this. We had local content requirements, which increased the bidding windows for solar from 35 to 45%. Primarily solar, PV, and wind turbine manufacturing benefited from this process. I think China has played a very important role in working with the wind turbine manufacturing and the solar bidding, and it was supported by government policies from the Department of Trade and Industry. Local financing, 70% of the 200 million was from domestic sources, and there was strong technical capacity from domestic banking sector. Within South Africa, BRICS and the Renewable Energy Cooperation, capital for climate smart infrastructure projects. There was no consensus on the green bond criteria, although the New Development Bank has now decided to issue green bonds to promote this. China and India are the top green bond issuers and indicate significant capacity. New Development Bank issued a green bond in 2016 in China. There's areas of cooperation. We had a dialogue on defining green bonds, capacity sharing among each other, and we're hoping to leverage the NDB and the BRICS capacity to assist other African countries. Trade and investment, the value chains, complementarity is there. You have manufacturing of polysilicon, ingot, and wafer production for PV modules. We're borrowing a lot of the technology from China here and Germany. We manufacture blades, gearboxes, and turbines for the wind turbines. And the areas of cooperation, we need for extensive value chain study for complementarity of this. Overall, the intra-BRICS trade in manufactured goods remains pretty low, and intra-BRICS investment also remains low in this area. Shale gas is something that we are talking about, but I don't want us to spend time on this because it's a debate that is still very controversial. and there's much argument around whether it should go ahead or not. So we'll pass that and we look at some of the financing of clean technologies. This was the topic that was supposed to be presented earlier today. So I will go through very quickly the policy context for financing within BRICS. So in order to limit temperature increases to 2 centigrade, investment in low carbon power generation and energy efficiency, we would need to increase that by 3 to 7 times, just to reduce it by 2 degrees centigrade. A vital need exists to mobilize at least $100 billion per year through the Green Climate Fund. This is supported by the BRICS. The BRICS recognize the need to focus on energy efficient technologies and encouraging investment for renewable energy. Despite the statements of the coalition at the BRICS summit, it is likely that the BRICS will remain reliant on coal for energy production. I don't know, Malcolm, David, if there was any new statement on this at the summit, but I don't think so. But I think many of the BRICS countries will remain reliant on coal. In terms of the energy mix, coal accounts for 81%, 68%, and 95% of electricity generation in China, India, and South Africa, respectively. Now, the access to the financial markets for energy investment. From a financial perspective, instruments can be broken down into cost-reducing and risk-reducing categories, and this is the table that we find there, the graph. Different sectors are exposed to different risks, and therefore they require tailor-made instruments to ensure efficiency and effectiveness. From the analysis, the most financial support for renewable energy is provided in the form of loans. The increased investment risk coupled with less developed debt and equity markets in the BRICS results in less ability to attract private investors. So that's a major constraint for that. Energy trends within the BRICS. BRICS renewable installed capacity target of 1,250 gigawatts by between 2020 and 2030. The cost of installed capacity is $975 million. Annual funding shortfall to meet is about $51 billion. And 4 out of the 5 BRICS member states are still amongst the top 10 countries for renewable energy investment, despite the falling short of the annual spend of renewable energy. From an inter-BRICS perspective, investment in renewable energy is highest in China and Brazil. You can see that in the figure, while Russia possesses the lowest renewable energy investment flows. But then again, Russia uses gas and hydroelectric power. Climate funds as a source of renewable energy investment. I won't go through this in detail. You can see it. All BRICS member states have managed to access the global market climate funds. The NDB provides a major source of funding for the renewable energy sector. The big controversy in South Africa and other BRICS countries is the balancing between renewable energy and nuclear and coal. Despite the greater push for focus on renewable energy investment by BRICS, it is likely that nuclear and coal-based energy will remain within the energy mix. South Africa has still got nuclear within the energy mix that it has in store. Financing coal-powered fire stations with carbon capture and storage as part of the clean technologies to use coal can deliver climate benefits through avoiding emissions. Coal-based power stations are refitted with carbon capture and storage, and this is economically efficient but inefficient and unfeasible. The finance of CCS has been compounded by the fact that countries like the World Bank has limited funding for these energy technologies. We need financial technology and innovation. The green bonds is about the best financing option that we have at the moment. It can be described as a traditional vanilla bonds with proceeds earmarked for green initiatives. And it's basically to fund renewable energy sources. Thank you very much. If anybody wants further information, you can ask questions and we can talk about it in greater detail. Now, I don't know whether, Professor Ben, you want to talk very briefly about the credit rating potential for BRICS, or we just open a discussion later on. We open the discussion later on. Okay. So what we can do now, we can have the discussant come forward and talk about some of the presentations here. And if you want to talk about the credit rating agencies as well, you can raise some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaya. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to briefly put forward some provocative thoughts and comments to ignite a discussion, a wider discussion in the audience about those very important topics that have been covered. I will start with this very important topic about governance with the emphasis on corruption. Governance is, especially for African countries, one of the most important issues that is undermining development, in the sense that corruption is destroying the credibility of institutions and therefore reduces the trust that people can have in the functioning of their institution, with a very important implication for the work towards development, for economic progress. But one of the aspects that have not been emphasized enough is that we have most of the time supposed that integrity with the public sector will reduce the level of corruption in general, or will solve the problems. I want to put a spotlight on the corruption in the private sector, the money trail of corruption. Where does this money come from that is destroying the integrity of public servants, public civil servants and the public officials? So it's very important to draw the attention on corruption, on the corruptors, rather than those who receive the bribes. Those who provide the bribery are as much at fault in undermining development as those officials who receive the money. Very recently, there was a study that was conducted to show that corruption benefits the corruptor. And as long as we assume that corruption is just an evil that is present in public officials, we will be missing the big point that the source of corruption is present, and it's aimed at protecting some big interests. And as long as we do not tackle those interests, we will actually be missing a part of the big picture. Maybe we should also look at the fact that whenever the corruption is being tackled, there are always loopholes. When we consider one of the important instruments for fighting corruption, the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it enables lots of loopholes so that corruption can always go on under a different form rather than trying to eliminate it totally. So I would like us to address this issue. Now let me move to the funding of peace and security. I also want to be provocative in the sense that whenever there is a conflict, we need to follow the money trail, because it is important to notice that wherever we have open conflict, there are a lot of natural resources and wealth that are around. So when we miss the money trail in conflict, we can be funding peace, but those who fund the wars that from which we want to seek peace are very well organized and they have a big money. So one of the ideas is how do we organize in the sense that we can be up to the task of those who organize and fund those wars, because wars are funded, the weapons are funded, the combats are funded, and most of the time we do not know exactly where those funding are coming from and the trend that they're following. But there is a need for a greater organization if we want to prevail and eliminate the conflict. About the credit rating, I think it has been emphasized in a good way that we need to be aware of the fact that credit rating, with all of its merit, is also a political instrument. And once we have understood that it's used to leverage some interest, then we put it in its own perspective, and then developing alternatives that can give a better and more balanced picture of the credit and the credibility of financial markets and the instruments in BRICS and other countries is a very good starting point. But we need, obviously, to avoid that the alternative credit rating falls into the same trappings as the existing credit rating agencies. The use of national currencies, very, very, very important. I would actually say it is common sense. Why would China need to convert its currency in any other currency when it wants to purchase something from Russia? And Russia, when it wants to purchase something from China, will go the same way and convert it in another currency, which means 2 times lost transaction costs for something that could be done immediately between the 2 countries. This is as an example that can be multiplied, of course, in all the other situations. So it's common sense to seek to reduce the multiplicity of transaction costs. But why has it not been done yet? We need to understand that there are huge forces for pushback. And when organizing the use of those currencies, we need to take that into account and play smart, because the pushback is very well organized, and we need to organize much smarter to find ways of getting around and face the risks that are associated with this pushback, because I think some countries have tried before. You are most probably aware of those who tried, but the organization means that people should be ready to face the consequences and organize in a smart way that it can be done without undermining the economies. Let me move quickly to the financing of clean energy. Again, the financing of clean energy should actually be obvious, because at the end of the day, whether we want it or not, the fossil fuels have a limited lifespan. So we better start today. But how do we organize the financing of clean energy in the sense that we do not abandon the potential benefits of fossil fuel, so in a way that we optimize the use of existing resources, but project for the long run. I was very recently discussing with my children, and just last Sunday, we were passing by a wind turbine, and they were one of them is studying something of renewable energy, was pointing towards the energy potential of a wind turbine, comparing with the fossil fuel. As it was indicated, fossil energy is still at an advantage when we do not take into consideration all of the externalities, and when we take just into consideration the immediate benefits, not the long-term benefits. So unless we invest massively in those energies to make them advantageous, we will still be playing with this kind of trade-off between the advantage of the fossil fuel and the long-term benefit of the renewable energy. How do we accelerate the passage from one to the other? By investing massively and reducing the cost and making them more attractive. It has been emphasized that Africa, for instance, with this exposure to sun energy, could become one of the world energy suppliers. But this supposes that we develop huge capacity with the massive investment, develop new technologies of harnessing the sun energy, go beyond the existing technologies so that the renewable energy becomes more advantageous. So to conclude, we need to organize much better to prevent wars and secure peace. We need to fight corruption, not just by preparing the integrity of our civil servant, but by infusing values that go beyond the public sector and address the private sector. You can just imagine some of private sectors bragging about having bribed the public officials and nobody pointing any finger to them. So they even brag about that. So we need to look at the way we consider corruption in our society and hold accountable everyone who is involved. That's my view. So with those ideas, with those thoughts, maybe we will have more questions. I want to open the floor to discussion.
Before you do that, sorry. Before you do that, I'd like to ask the minister. She wants to leave, but she wants to make a few comments before she leaves. Now she's got to go to the airport. Yeah. So, Minister, I'd like to invite you very quickly to come forward. Okay, you can speak on there too.
Thank you very much. Firstly, as I have to now rush to the airport, I'd like to thank all who have traveled from far to be here. And thank you for making BRICS alive, because BRICS is not about the event when there is a summit. BRICS is about what you are doing now and continuing. And also may I go to the university also that we need to prepare for the next BRICS summit. Once one goes, we prepare for the other, but you cannot be preparing documents just for the sake of reporting when there's nothing tangible that we have seen there. Thank you very much. The second issue I'd like to raise is I really would like to thank my brother who's now rounding up the name.
Alexis.
Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Alexis, because I was going to go back to the first presentation that was dealing with ethics and governance and ethics, because I am of the view that there is something that we're missing, maybe from the South African perspective. If we can start dealing with these issues at school, primary school, at our own homes and families, by the time people get to that level, and maybe the consciousness has been inculcated from them. I'm not saying that those that are as old as I am, cannot still inculcate. But I think as a new society, a new community, there are certain values that really we can't think people are only going to have them when they go to university and so forth. Also, with regard to the same thing of governance and ethics, I feel in the South African context, there's a lot of focus on the public sector and the politicians, which is right, because we have to hold public servants and public representatives accountable. But it goes to what my brother is saying, that when it comes to corruption, we then focus on that, instead of saying, let's focus on that, but also let us strengthen our institutions. Because if the institutions are strong enough to catch somebody who's even thinking of moving towards acting towards a particular something, then you are able to catch them. We catch them too late, way down the line. Then we spend money going in and out of courts and all. And even the government process of finally saying you are guilty of this and that. If you see the processes, they are frightening. They are very long. And then when you even try to push, then you've got others that are saying, we are union, we are standing for this. Sometimes you find that they can see that the person is wrong. But we ourselves have put systems in place which are right on the other hand, because we need to defend innocent people. But then when we can see that somebody has done something wrong, but we want to go through all this entire process, and at the end, you discover that actually, you don't discover, As you are going there, you know that that person is wrong. So my view is we need to look at how can we strengthen our institutions, because you are right when you're saying it's about the human being, it's about the person and how the person relates. But persons are not the same. You can come from the same mother and whatever, you'll never be the same. So if we strengthen our institutions, because see the countries we are talking about today, those are 500 years of democracy. You can imagine if you were to go back and check where they were when they were at 24 years of democracy. You'd be shocked to find that they went through exactly the same things. But my view is that we don't have to go through the same. We can jump those processes by ensuring that we create proper institutions that can protect the ordinary people. Because here the corruption that we are talking about, the people who lose is more the people who are in the outside, is more the poor people. And again, in South Africa, the focus, we don't go to the private sector. You can take papers on daily basis. You will hardly find anything that is related to the corruption that is embedded in the institution. In fact, some of the private sector systems, they even have names for these things, which are nice names. Consultancy fees and this, that fees. And then when we look at it, we don't even want to think about the fact that let's dig into that. What's that consultancy fee? Consulting for what? We don't even go, now we are talking about the life, how much a person has, like houses and what do you call it now? Lifestyle audits. Yeah, let's go for lifestyle audits. But let me tell you what's going to happen. The lifestyle audit is going to be one-sided. The other side, which is an unbelievable lifestyle. When we're busy sitting here looking at bricks, some people are in yachts somewhere, roaming the world, making money out of this very country, and they are roaming the world when it's convenient. When it's warmer, they're going to come back because they've made enough money. My view is, my brother is so right in saying that those civil servants who are sitting there, who, by the way, government does so much to try and assist them in education, assist them in understanding their space, enforcing upon them that they're serving people and not serving themselves. As soon as some of them, because I also hate this thing of generalizing about civil servants. There are many civil servants who wake up in the morning and do nothing but serve their people. There are a few of them who are there who are greedy, who are always looking for more and more, despite the fact that this government, in the 24 years that we've been there, hardly can you find people who are working who say, I wasn't paid this month. They get paid almost every month. So this issue of looking at who is holding the money and giving We need to have these discussions about it. We need to expose it. Unfortunately, the media on the other side is directing people one side. The media's responsibility is to assist us build our communities for the future. But they tend to focus on showing how ugly one side is. And remember when I was speaking that my view is that let's review the 24 years, 25 years that we've been in government. Let's look for the ugly side of things that have happened. Let's squeeze the life out of those things that are ugly, including the issue of corruption. But let's widen the scope when it comes to corruption, because right now all you see on TV is us. Don't see anybody else. You just see us. And the face of corruption in South Africa, unfortunately, is black. The other side is not corrupt. We are the only people who are corrupt. So we need to open up the discussion. And I can never defend corruption at any point because I know what it does in removing money. But I think the South African context of looking into it, it's making even young people who are doing a lot of things for themselves, developing their own businesses. The minute they drive around in their nice little car, they're labeled. People don't even ask. They just see them and they think they either corrupt or they're involved in drugs or they're involved in something. Why? Because they're black. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, parting shots, Minister. We really appreciate you having come all the way from your time, and we give you a warm farewell applause. Thank you very much. Chairman Secretary, please. Now we can open the floor for discussion, and if you want to talk about credit rating agencies and have questions, then you can answer.
I can say a few words.
Okay. Yeah. Where's the mic? There's a mic there.
Thank you. Since both of you and Alexis talked about the credit agencies, I think there are a few things, obviously, which are critical to the success, to supplement what the three credit rating agencies are doing already in today's world. And credit rating, we all know, it's a public good. To a certain extent, Fitch, Moody's, S&P, they are acting as part of the public institution to a certain extent. And as users, we sometimes need to ask ourselves, why are we rely on them 100%? We are a little bit too lazy just to say, well, this is a AA rated, so I can invest. So that's one thing from the user side. But if we want to create something that would hopefully further improve what the current system offers, I think there are a few things we need to work out. First and foremost, that within the BRICS, our own public financial rating, our own sovereign rating are relatively low. And that would help explain why the currencies of rand from South Africa or rupee are not used by the other side of the trade transactions. So I think the store value, the stability, and also the easiness to use, for example, renminbi, it's not clear yet. So that's from the financial infrastructure perspective, I think one thing yet. Secondly, is really recently there has been something which are actually disappointing for us. In China, there is a Chinese rating agency. It's called Dagong. They did something fishy. We counted on them to provide the public good, but they themselves didn't have the integrity to do what is expected from a rating agency. Having said that, I think there are something which is interesting. That is the fintech. That's my favorite topic. Just imagine that when Moody's, S&P, you do the ratings, you rely on the financial reports audited by Pricewaterhouse, by Ernst & Young. but it's usually the larger corporates, public listed companies, and thirdly, the data are usually the past data, past performance. Today, you can do the ratings on a real-time basis, on a more future-forward basis. For example, through big data, you can actually monitor a factory's output. How many vehicles are coming to pick up the products on a real-time basis? That's more relevant and more valuable to rate the company than last year's financial report. I think things are changing, so I think to a certain extent, the current system isn't perfect. I don't think anyone will argue about it, but in the meantime, what is going to take to improve the system? I personally feel big system is one thing. We probably need better governance to further improve our own, I guess, international profile. And secondly, I suppose technology. The fintech probably gives us an opportunity to leapfrog the existing infrastructure, existing players. So that's just what I want to say. Thank you.
We can have more questions. Yes, Amina. We have a few minutes because tea should be at 1:30. We can just take a few minutes.
Good afternoon. I was very interested in the discussion on the trading in national currencies, because this morning when I switched on my radio, I heard that the American president had tweeted about South Africa, an incorrect tweet, and immediately we have the value of the rand falling. And I'm asking myself, why is it that we have to bear the economic impact of such tweets? Because fundamentally, what does it say? It says that we are no longer, as a country, being evaluated on the basis of the soundness of economic policies, but rather the sentiments of a politician. And so it's very disconcerting. And at the same time, I was just thinking about, the implications of what had happened in Turkey and the impact that it had on all emerging currencies. And suddenly our Reserve Bank is contemplating whether or not we should increase the interest rate, which has real impacts on the real economy. And so for me, as a concerned global citizen, we should do something about strengthening the integrity of the system. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I'll ask the presenters each one to respond, and the discussant can make a conclusion remark as well. So perhaps we can start from Balwa.
Yes, thank you.
You can address some of the minister's comments as well.
I think also the discussion that we make a very important analysis. Of course, I agree that corruption, stifles economic development. It drops poor and pay John. It drops the poor and pay the tycoons by the world standards. It creates an equal society. So it's an intolerable, malaise that needs to be tackled, intentionally and critically. In my presentation, I raised an argument that we need to, reconstruct, the conceptualization of corruption within the BRICS community. And I agree with the discussing that normally, the definitional, understanding of corruption is tilted to the corrupted and not the corrupter. So there must be a sort of a clear field, an equalization of this understanding, because the corrupter and the corruptee, are equally guilty. And we need to wrestle with that. And that's why that Transparency International, that color, the countries which are exposed to corruption, red. I think that phenomena is unbalanced because the corruptors play a role in the corrupted countries, and as a result, the issue of analyzing countries need to be looked from a different perspective. How do you shorten the procedures of pouncing on the corrupt, elements? In South Africa, we are a constitutional democracy, and unfortunately, you need to exhaust all the legal processes. There's no shortcut to it. All the matters need to be dealt with legally, procedurally, and otherwise. And unfortunately, it takes time, it takes long, and the cost of corruption is actually very expensive because there's a legal weight into these matters. And as a result, at the end of the day, even the corruptors are scot-free in the court. We have seen them, but yet we know that they are corrupt. So I don't know how we want to resolve this, but we are a constitutional democracy where the rule of law and these matters need to be taken into consideration. I will not deliberate much about the human factor, and I agree with the minister that the values need to be embedded, right through the curricularization of some of these programs, starting from the primary or elementary level, embedded into this. And I said this takes time to correct behaviors and to make these behaviors acceptable. Strengthening institutions, as indicated that in all of those countries we have institutions, and we also have the legislation that has been put. I would invite all of you, those who are interested, to look at this matter on the 5 to 9 of October this year, where we have international seminar. The information is there in the pack. It details the issues where we'll be dealing with them directly, because here there's not much of the space.
You can make a closing comment.
No, thank you again. The point I want to emphasize on is the practicality of realizing what we can do with already what we have at our hands as BRICS development agencies, and the resources and the research outcomes and the research expertise and knowledge that we have already put into our works, and that much of what we need to realize funding into peace and security to yield development is at hand. Thank you.
James, just a quick response to that comment that comment this morning. It's just it's Saturday. The world today, it's the economy. As long as a global economy is still under the control of the Western powers, e.g. the US, IMF, World Bank, you will have that problem. I want to refer to the work of Richard Dothwaite, the UK guy. He says that way back, the countries that developed today were depending on the cultural sector, which was a very huge sector, right? He says then, as time went on, This side became reduced, and then the tertiary sector took on. He says it was almost like a pyramid, where on top it was the tertiary sector. He says now the pyramid is turned upside down. He says we've got a huge unemployment, and of course a little bit of agricultural sector. He says on top of the pyramid, its base is upwards now. So on top of that are speculators. These are the guys, because of the trade liberalization and capital liberalization. Those guys, the moment they hear anything about your country, they move their money out and go elsewhere. And that is the reason we find that a statement such as what is made now by Donald Trump in tweet has weakened the rand, and it's so fast, So secondly, the developing countries do not have sufficient domestic savings. There is a gap between the domestic savings and the savings they get from other countries, like for instance, your stock and your bonds. And they're at the mercy of what's happening in the global space. The shocks that take place in the global space has a negative effect in those countries. That is why you find the rand is so volatile. For a small little thing that happens, it hits a rand. During the time of Zuma's regime, the rand was very much sensitive to political stance of South Africa, because the investors were looking at what's happening in your country. If it's high risk, we pull our money out, then your rand weakens. What we need to do is mention about interest rate increase. Sometimes they do raise interest rate as a way of strengthening the currency, but we can't do that in South Africa because it will be very bad for our economy. But what we can do to mitigate that risk, I think we need to work on sectors that are attracting foreign currency, e.g., your tourism sector. You need to start, because then if you improve your tourism sector, you draw much foreign currency in your economy, you boost your local currency. But now, what's the challenge in the tourism sector in South Africa at the moment? It is crime. It is service delivery. So if you can't work on those two areas, you will always be at the mercy of the US mentioning something and then our end is weak. I think there's a way for that we can help our country to face the challenge and respond to the challenge of weak currency.
Thank you very much. You have any comments to make? Yeah. 1 minute. Yeah. Okay, I will be very brief. I think most of the comments have been made, especially this one of depending on Western superpower for everything that we are doing. We have to understand this and develop strategies aimed at disentangling our economies from that dependence. Just another example, it's not just about economy. In addition to what our sister has said, if you imagine that in Brazil, when they project, the polls project that a certain candidate is going to win, which is a manifestation of democracy, and then the currency drops, we have a huge problem. If markets are choosing the leader that they see fit for our countries. So we need to be aware of all of that. I think I can stop here. Thank you very much. Just some housekeeping announcements. We can go for tea now, and tea is outside, and then we can come back here for the session, the final plenary session that we have at 15:45 or 15:47 if we want, and then we can conclude and go back to the hotel, and the gala dinner is at the hotel later this evening. So at the Marine Hotel, so it's not far from your place. Okay, I thank everybody, and I'd like to thank all the speakers and presenters and the discussants for your very insightful comments. And then thank you for saving the day on the credit rating. And those are very insightful comments. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice tea. Thank you, Jaya.
Thank you. You saved the day.
I'm very glad that you dare say, when they say these ideas, now they call me radical. But the good thing with me is that I'm not afraid of being
I was asking students about choice of. I said, guys, do we still have a government? If they come, because I said, if President Ramaphosa, for some reason, markets are on the top. If he's just if President Ramaphosa just start to shuffle his cabinet, anytime that they say he does that, the market will definitely talk. They will put the price. So Ramaphosa can't do anything because now he's got his boss, which is the markets, and tell him what to do. Yeah. So our economy is centralized around the president. They can't. Person of you don't touch those guys. You know,
because they are not liberal.
Yes, because the markets are going to start from. So it shouldn't be like that. We have
shouldn't be like
lost possible completely.
Absolutely, we have transformed our economic system into a religion in allegiance to neoliberals, which is actually is supporting this. This is what it is. We call it what it is. But I'm very glad to see people who share this idea. I think we really need to have a long and deep discussion about those issues.
Those issues.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm still a sovereign state.
With me, it's very easy because I'm not sensitive to any pressure. I'm not sensitive. As long as I